Okay, we can go ahead and get started since all our presenters are here. So hello everyone and welcome to NCOBPS 53rd annual meeting and the Political Identity and Community Organizing panel. Today we have three wonderful papers by Nykia, Greene-Young, Jasmine, Noelle, Yarish, and Kimberly, Shella. And just a few reminders. Please donate to NCOBPS, and you can use the QR code here to do so. And also, if you would like to update your information on the NCOBPS website, please use this QR code as well. And I can go back to any of them at any time. Okay, so we're going to go in order of first start with Kimberly's paper. And if you would like to share your screen, I believe you have the ability to do so. Sorry, you're muted, Kimberly. I can't hear you.
Oh, as I said, just give me one moment. I'm trying to lower all of my background stuff. I was looking at my paper, you know, preparing. Okay, so. Okay, so this project is actually part of my dissertation, and it's a small chunk of it. But this element of it is looking at how it's comparing transnational movements to local movements and looking specifically, Black local movements, looking specifically at Black Lives Matter compared to other protests such as Zwart Piet, French anti-racist movements, and movements such as Stephen Lawrence in Britain. Okay. So just a little background to understand what is the context. So, and I don't think I have to explain Black Lives Matter given the panel, but okay, so there have been protests. The Black Lives Matter, I'm sure most of you know, spread well beyond the US, for example, and it's spread in a way which is suggestive of a transnational movement. And I'll define that in just a minute. The protest emerged across Europe, for example, and you can see it most visually when protests erupted in June 2020 after the death of George Floyd. For example, there were 50,000 protesters in Vienna, 10,000 protesters in Brussels, 30,000 in Berlin, 10,000 in Paris. I have to move this. Hold on 1 second, sorry. 10,000 in Paris, all of which were focused on Black Lives Matters. There are some other movements that also have emerged and moved, transnational movements, which I haven't looked at in this paper, such as, well, in Britain and Canada and Italy, it's become known as Take a Knee. It's not spread as far, so I'm focusing primarily on Black Lives Matters. My research question, and these are some images from some of the protests, as you can see, in Europe, and my study and my work focuses on representation and the emergence of representation of ethnic minorities in Europe. And what I mean by ethnic minorities, I'm referring to racial minorities. The reason I don't use racial minorities has in part to do with how ethnic minorities organize and identify in many of the European countries, or some of the European countries. Even though many use Black, they organize and often mobilize, and they engage in co-ethnic voting, often based on their ethnic identity. For example, in Britain, even though they're Black Britons, and many people will identify as Black Britons, they tend to organize based on whether they're Afro-Caribbean or of African descent. They have quite different experiences and quite different backgrounds depending on those ethnicities. So for me, it's important to focus on their ethnicity, even though the groups, all the groups I'm talking about are racial groups. It's important to divide them into their ethnic groups, because that is critical to how they participate and when they participate. That won't become so apparent in this paper, but in my broader project. So it carries through, my broader dissertation carries through. So, but the central question for this paper is, how has the external pressure created by the international character of the Black Lives Movement produced more measurable gains in, has the external pressure created by the international character of Black Lives Matter movement produced more measurable gains in political power and identity for European Black African diaspora than local movements? And how has the international BLM movement versus the local ethnic movements affected the nomination of Black and other ethnic minority candidates in the West outside the United States? But what I mean by transnational movements, I'm using the broadest definition of transnational movements that Keck and Sikkink identify, which are networks formed globally around an idea. More broadly, they're talking about movements based on an idea, and that it is, and the underlying concept is that it's activists who alter political systems, and alter political participation of all types, and including social inclusion. But these studies tend to focus on rights, mobilization, and identity more than representation, which is my primary interest in this dissertation, or will be in this paper and in my broader dissertation. In fact, few focus on non-Western ethnic minorities in the West, and few even look at representation. There is some representation literature, Deborah Yashar, Donovan Coate, who look at Latin America and look at indigenous groups rather than Black groups and representation. Few look, they don't look at Afro-Latinos, Latinos only at indigenous Latinos. And also, this studies tend to look just purely at movements, but not examining in depth how institutional constraints alter not only the protest, but how the protests affect the outcomes. And nor do they look at internal party dynamics. And why internal party dynamics matters is that when we're dealing with Europe, political party membership in Europe is quite different from political party membership in the US, in that to be elected at the local, national, regional, you have to join a party, and to join a party, you have to be actually formally apply and be admitted. It's a more closed process. So it matters what the internal dynamics of the party are, because they decide who gets in. They're effectively, the common term is that they are the gatekeepers of representation in Europe. Okay, now the transnational literature treats candidates and parties as part of the movement. The assumption is that representation doesn't really happen unless the movement creates a party of its own, and that the ethnic minorities who participate in that movement, who become part of the party, are the ones who become representatives. But unlike Latin America or many other places, ethnic minorities, non-Western ethnic minorities, meaning Black, Asian, Latino, Maghrebi, Arab candidates rarely create their own party, and the few parties that exist are not very successful. There are, with the exception of two parties in the Netherlands, which one has 3 MPs and one has 1. So it's important to look at the party dynamics. And another important thing pointing out, they assume that people go through the movement to the party, but often and increasingly, non-Western ethnic minorities join existing parties, sometimes as young as 13 and 16. They have these young PSA, young parties, the socialists, young CDU, where you join at 13 and 16, and that is where the origin and the genesis of your political participation, if you are a representative, comes from, in most part. The dominant literature for for ethnic representation, meaning the literature that looks at Europe and looks at why do ethnic minorities and how do ethnic minorities in Europe. And what I mean by ethnic minorities in this sense, I'm talking racial minorities, what in Canada they call visible minorities, ethnic minorities literature, and that's the term they use. They do not use racial minorities. They argue that electoral system rules like PR and plurality determine who gets elected or how many ethnic minorities get elected. With PRs, but nobody agrees on which one. Some say PR, some say plurality, but most studies find that there is no real difference in the effect of PR and plurality. Others argue that citizenship and integration regimes determine who gets in and who does not. In other words, more inclusive regimes like Canada versus less inclusive regimes. More inclusive regimes like Canada and Australia, but less inclusive regimes like Germany should have less representation. But what we see is not quite that simple. We see almost no representation. In fact, no Black candidates in Australia. We saw representation of Blacks, but far less than their number, even though there are far more ethnic minorities in MPs in Canada. They are far less represented. Okay, party ideology. Looking at party ideology, we find that's not necessarily true. It depends on the country or the party. So party ideology is subjective. In some countries, most of the representation happens within left parties. In other countries, there's about equal between left and center and right parties. So it's not clear. None of these things really explain what's going on. Any immigrant sentiment, some argue that the higher the immigrant sentiment, the less ethnic minorities get elected. But we see a burst of representation in France, just as what's used to be called Front National, but now is called National Rally, is taking off. And so is ethnic representation. That's true in Netherlands and many other countries. Ethnic population size does not necessarily determine who gets represented. There are large ethnic minorities populations in Germany, very little representation. Larger ethnic minority populations in Australia, very little representation, but large representation in Canada and Britain. Yet the size of ethnic minorities in these countries are about the same. And the most dominant model right now is the assumption that you balance, parties balance, they are vote maximizers. So if ethnic minority voters, the number of ethnic minority voters starts to exceed the number of any immigrant voters, then ethnic minorities the number of ethnic minorities nominated and elected will shoot up. Parties will choose them. But there's other problems with this approach. They have difficulty explaining inter-country differences in representation, as I've been talking about, but more importantly, they can't explain why we see low representation of Afro-Europeans, even where there are sizable populations in Belgium, Netherlands, Canada. In fact, in Canada, Afro-European or Afro-Canadian representation has actually gone down. Same thing in Netherlands. It started high, relatively high, went down in Belgium, has slowed in Britain until recently. So there's ups and downs which can't simply be explained by electoral rules, and they don't correlate with the recent rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, which has been rising constantly. And the success of these parties, the far right parties have become the second, in the most recent election, second, third, and fourth largest parties in the country. And in Belgium, the largest party in NVA is considered not quite far right, but certainly any immigrant, yet Belgium has the highest representation, one of the highest representations of ethnic minorities. So it can't explain that, it can't explain the timing, and it can't explain, most importantly, the rise of Black and other ethnic minority leaders. Let me skip that. My argument is that the rise and decline of non-Western ethnic minority representation of West is due to the international pressure that transnational movements exert. It activates concerns in the party about external reputation of the party internationally and domestically. There's other factors which are in my broader dissertation, but not in this. Electoral crises also can generate it. In other words, we see ethnic minorities, especially Black party leaders, arising when parties have their largest electoral losses in recent memory. So there are opportunities created which Black candidates seize when there's large electoral losses, because fewer people, even though it's open because you have to resign if you've had a massive loss, the party leader has to resign. But other people are afraid that, and with such large losses, if they become party leader the next election, they won't win. So you get fewer of the top possible leaders running. So you have an opening. My hypothesis are where protests are linked to transnational and local movements, where protests linked to transnational local movements increase, the ethnic representation is more likely to increase. Transnational protests increase the likelihood of international pressure on political parties. Protests link transnational movements, protests linked to transnational protest movements are likely to increase ethnic representation, more likely ethnic representation than protests linked to local movements. And where local protests are directed at specific parties by traditional voter bases or during electoral crisis, parties are more likely to increase representation. My study looks at 20 cases. Right now there's 16. As I said, this is a paper in development. It is a part of my dissertation. So to a certain extent, some of the data is still not firmed up enough because it's very difficult to identify often ethnic minority candidates, especially in Europe, especially in PR systems where the focus is on the party, not on the candidate. So there's less written about him. Multiple cases. The key thing about my thing, I wanted multiple cases, so I have variation. Different Black Lives Matter protests have different start dates, so it reduces the correlation by chance. Different local movements is less likely to overlook the effect if local movements vary in influence, so they also should vary in influence. These are the countries, and the number, what you see next to them are the number of elections that are included, so it is a reasonably sizable sample. My sample goes from 1980 to 2022, which means, of course, a couple of the cases are not included because at the end, because they have not yet held their elections this year. Okay, and this is just a glance at the protests that we see. You can see a list of the number of protests and the elections that are post BLM, the local BLM outbreak, and you can see the initial date of the protests in each of these countries. One thing, almost all those countries had at least for many, like Britain, the protests broke out in 2014, very early on. Others, 2016, 15, but most of the countries did not see a large Black Lives Matter protest until 2020. So eventually this paper will have party year and country level analysis, but country and party, but right now my analysis focuses on the country level analysis. And right now it's multi-level analysis. And I'll tell you later at the end that I'm expanding to some other forms of analysis as well. The case studies where I'm looking at how these protests have changed the internal dynamics of the party are Britain, France, and the Netherlands. And the protests I'm looking at in Britain, Iraq war protests, Stephen Lawrence's death. Stephen Lawrence was a young man who was killed by, as he was coming home from studying for his exams to get in college, he was killed by local white thugs, racist thugs. Iraq war protest. That is primarily a Bangladeshi protest, but it was very important, so I put it in there as a comparison. Labor Black sections, which happened early on. These were movements within a party where Black party members mobilized to push for more representation. And VO protests. Since I'm running out of time, I'll give you a highlight of these, explain what each of these happened with each of these movements before I get to the quantitative data. So I can at least tell you about how these protests affected the outcome. So in Britain, the Iraq war protests, 2001, which were Bangladeshis, primarily were the most engaged with this protest because Muslims and other groups, but particularly Bangladeshi Muslims, were engaged in the anti-war protests. They saw it as an attack on Muslims. And what we saw after 2001 was a sudden burst in representation for ethnic minority, for war protests. And how it happened was that Bangladeshis threatened to leave the party, and in fact, they did. Many left for Lib Dem party. So there was an internal dynamic and an internal discussion about party members leaving, of Bangladeshi party members leaving, and this external process, this loss, this crisis led the Labour Party to increase the number of ethnic candidates, even led Conservative Party to nominate a few candidates to try to attract away these people. Stephen Lawrence, these voters, Stephen Lawrence's death in 1997. Well, let me start with the Labour Black sections. They were most active in the 83 and 87 protests. Before that point, there had been no ethnic minority, no Blacks elected to Parliament in Britain since World War II. How am I doing on time? I'm sorry. Hello?
I think we're out of time.
Okay. Okay, let me just show you one other thing. I will jump to my quantitative results. Okay. Well, okay. Well, let me just do one more thing. It'll be quicker to do this. I will, what we do see is we see an effect that is sizable and significant, but just to give you an idea of who are these politicians. For example, Marielle Ngoso, she joined the NDP in about the SDP in Austria and SPO in Austria in 2010. The young generation, which is SPO's Vienna young group. That means when she was very young, she became SPD leader in Vienna, state party MP, Vienna council leader, but she went the opposite way that most of the theory suggests. Most of the theory says you come from movements into it. She became an organizer for the Black Lives Matter protest in June 2020, and she's been twice national party candidate in the wake of the protests in Austria. Harlem Desir in France, co-founder and first head of SOS Racisme, one of the first two anti-racism organizations. But he became a PS, he became Party Socialist Party MEP, meaning member of European Parliament. He became party leader, Minister for European Affairs. He's now OSCE Freedom of Representation, Freedom of Press representative and head of International Rescue Committee. What we see is the younger leaders, the ones who are where there's a burst of protest, these are coming. Protest representation has risen drastically. But the people who are where you see these large rises in ethnic minority candidates and leaders, these are the Muriel, the model is the Muriel Ngoso model. These young, the most recent people were all members of the young party movements and moved and became MPs. And in the early years, when there were very few MPs, there were people who came like Harlem Desir from a activist movement into parties, but that resulted in very little representation. So I would argue it's the internal dynamics, the internal mobilization, internal discussion. I have more data and more examples, but I don't have time. But thank you for listening. Sorry about running out of time, but thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Nykia. Am I saying your name right? I'm sorry. Okay. And you're muted still. So. And Kimberly, can you stop sharing for a second?
Yeah, I'm trying to open the thing here. Sorry. Sorry. Oh, there. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. And thank you. Yes, my name is Nykia. I don't know if you heard me. All right, I will share my screen. Here we go. All right, can everyone see the presentation? All right. So, hello everyone. My name is Nykia Greene-Young, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Park Atlanta University. And this paper, or what I'll be discussing today, is my dissertation research. So my dissertation research is theorizing Black women's political identity and activism in the United States, from Claudia Jones to Black Lives Matter. And it is, this is my true dissertation research. I actually am working on my proposal now. Hold on just a minute. All right, so I start with a quote. If women want any rights more than what they've got, why don't they just take them and not be talking about it? Sojourner Truth. So the purpose of my paper, or the purpose of this study, like I said, the title is Theorizing Black Women's Political Identity and Activism in the United States, from Claudia Jones to Black Lives Matter. In this research, I'm going to explore, explain, and theorize how Black women's political identity shape their political activism and leadership roles in social movements, the Black community, and in representative politics and elected politics in the United States. So the research is going to explore 3 levels of analysis, and that's the personal, the Black community, and the US. The research will begin with Claudia Jones, and she was a Black feminist, Communist Party leader, and political activist in the United States, but she also was transnational and in Europe. And I'm working with her in her time, or I'm working on her time in the United States, and it's in around the 40s or the 50s, when she was active in politics and active in political activism and the Communist Party in the United States. So I'm looking at how she locates Black women and their oppressions and militancy in the US. Her location of Black women will be used as the framework for this research. Jones places Black women at the vanguard of a radical praxis and Black feminist lens. The research project will use this framework as a way of thinking about how we arrive at the rise that we've seen and steady continuation of Black women's political activism in social movements and representative and elected politics and leadership in both. To current social movements in particular, we're going to look at Black Lives Matter, who was co-founded by 3 Black women. The research will theorize the relationship between Black women's identities and their political activism in different forms. I'm looking at multiple forms of activism. I'm actually looking at an approach, or the explanation that Patricia Hill Collins gives on activism. So I'm looking at multiple levels of activism. Some are very silent and are everyday activism. Some are done in leadership in women in different positions. Some are done in protest activism. And there's multiple levels of activism I'll look at. So Black women's identities are those that intersect and have caused oppressions in multiple forms as well. These identities are political because they have caused oppression, and they are personal as well. Minimize this. No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to minimize my. Okay, there we go. All right. So I want to make sure that I make it clear that there's an understanding in this paper, this study and this project. There's an understanding of radical political activism that Claudia Jones did engage in. She was a very radical figure, and she engaged as the lead in leadership in the Communist Party as extremely radical. And due to the title of this project and the rationale for introducing a revolutionary figure like Claudia Jones, but putting her on the likes or alongside Black Lives Matter's co-founders, which are 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, to address identity. There is an understanding in this project that there has been a marked de-radicalization of Black politics post the 1970s in the US, and also in movements and Black movements. Black women's leadership in these movements, however, remain a key feature, given that Black women are hyper-exploited. Thus, there has been a marked de-radicalization, in Black liberation politics in the US, and the condition of Black women's hyper-exploitation has not gone away. So Black women are continued to be compelled to be at the forefront of these Black movements, including being made leaders in these movements due to their hyper-exploitations and the contradictions. So failure of the liberal integration project that has de-radicalized Black movements in the US that still exists, but Black women are still at the forefront of these movements. So regardless of the de-radicalization of Black politics and Black movements, we still see Black women here and in front of these movements. So statement of the problem. So the research will explore the identities as a unique population, right? The identities of Black women as a unique population that has been impacted by intersectionality of gender, race, and class. The central question that I'm asking in this project is, have Black women's identities and political activism caused a rise in Black women's leadership in social movements and representative politics? There's some other questions that are going to come up in this research, or that have come up in this research. And they are, is leadership of Black women inherent due to their identities and roles they have? How do these identities appear in their lives and impact their lives and the lives of the Black community and the US as a whole? How does Black women's activism appear in the US? And do Black women have any choice but to be activists and leaders in their families, communities, and communities due to their political identities, their locations, their positions, and in their communities and families? And lastly, how has Black women's forms of leadership, location and leadership, been shaped by the identities ascribed to them and the structural oppression they face? So in this research, I'm looking at several Black feminist thoughts, thinkers, and other theorists as well. Claudia Jones being one, Pauli Murray, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Carol Boyce Davies, Erica Lawson, Bell Hooks, Daniel Morgan, Melissa Harris Perry, Angela Davis, and Alicia Garza. Here's another quote that I love. Because of them, I can now live the dream. I am the seed of the free, and I know it. I intend to bear great fruit. Sojourner Truth. So in this research, I'm using some mixed methodology and mixed methods. The research methodology that will be used in the project will, first I'll start with collecting data. Well, let me say, the data is going to be qualitative and quantitative. I'll start with collecting some field research by doing some focus groups and of multiple groupings of Black women, and also some personal in-depth interviews. There's also going to be an experimental approach through the interviews, as well, to theorize the experience of Black women, the experiences of Black women in the US. The interviews will be conducted by using cluster sampling of different groupings and different Black women in different aspects of community. So I'm also using intersectionality as a method. So intersectionality as a method and tool will be used due to Black women's unique intersecting oppressions of race, class, and gender, and how it impacts all aspects of their lives. Intersectionality is being used because it offers advantages over other frameworks. And it's formulated to contend with social and political complexities that accompany changes and with descriptive composition and basically the racial state of the United States. So that is the reason why I'm using intersectionality. There will also be an examination of existing secondary qualitative data on Black women and their political identities and the rise in the US politically. There'll be content analysis of literature that includes intersectionality, identity, Black motherhood, mother work and mothering. Black motherhood, mother work and mothering is a very integral part of this project. I'm looking at Black women's experiences and political activism in the US, feminism and Black feminism, and radicalized or racialized motherhood and trauma. So I'm looking at Black motherhood because I'm looking at state violence and how Black mothers have had to become, I would say, militant, but also had to become activists for their children since the beginning of time, and since slavery, or the beginning of Blacks in the US. There are certain terms that will be, they're major concepts and theories. Some of the concepts, like I said, are racialized motherhood. I won't go through all of them, but Black women, leadership, social activism, and mother work. Mother work is coined by Patricia Hill Collins, and mother work is mothering done by Black women, and it may not be that these Black women are mothers, and they may be mothering communities or other people in the community or other children in the community, but it doesn't mean that they are mothers themselves, or it doesn't mean that they're mothering their own children. Some of the theories and frameworks that I'm going to use is intersectionality, Black feminist thought, Black feminism, and feminism. My variables for the research, my independent variables are rise in leadership in social politics, social movement, a rise in leadership in representative politics. My dependent variables are intersectionality, political activism, Black womanhood, and Black motherhood. So I just want to outline some of my research for you, the chapters and what my research will look like. I'll have my introduction and my proposal. And then I'm going to look at Black women's identities and intersectionality. I want to look at racialized trauma and Black motherhood. I want to look at Black women and social movements. Then I'll move on to Black women and politics and looking at them in representative and elected politics and the rise. And ultimately, I want to look at what has happened and if this has happened, in fact, Black women and the rise and leadership of social movements and representative and elected politics. And then I will conclude with that. And this is something that is very dear to me. I remember first seeing this and I was just amazed. And it's a quote by Paula Mary. If anyone should ask a Negro woman in America what has been her greatest achievement, her honest answer would be, I survived, by Paula Mary. And that is my research. So I welcome any questions at the end. Thank you. I think I'm stopping sharing.
Thank you. That was great. So next we'll have Jasmine, and I believe you're our final presenter.
Did I stop sharing? I'm sorry. I want to make sure.
Not yet.
Not yet. It's still.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, I'm trying to find my screen. Always fun. Advanced. All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen. One moment, being difficult. All right, can everybody see my screen? You can hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Gregory. All right, so I want to begin with a short land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land upon which I currently reside are the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. I take this opportunity to honor them as the original caretakers of this land and recognize the history of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has resulted in the current iteration of the beautiful Black city that is the center of my research, in which I call home, that is Philadelphia. So in doing so, I identify that settler colonialism and racial capitalism are co-constituent structures of oppression. So as I just said, Philadelphia is the center of my research, but today I'm actually going to be presenting a new research project. It's very new, so I apologize if any of this gets a little muddled. This project has been birthed out of multiple years of teaching a course on political ideology and observing, as we do as political scientists, the events that are happening around us. So the crossroad that this project is sitting between is the push for women to become more engaged in political representation, as was represented in the film the documentary film Knock Down the House. That, of course, came after the large Women's March in 2017, but also the continuance of the majority of white women to support the normalization of fascism in the United States. So this piece is called Craftivism as Feminism, Bricolage as Abolitionism, and the Not Quite White Candidacy of Paula Jean Swearengin. In the Netflix documentary Knock Down the House, Rachel Lear introduces the audience to 4 women from the margins of the American political landscape, aiming to enter its center of power, Congress. 2 of them, one Latina and one African American, were ultimately successful in that goal. The success of these 2 women of color sits in contrast to the essential role played by the majority of white women to elect Donald Trump and the minority of that same demographic who turned to craftivism to express their disdain for the 2016 election results. So as I said, or I probably didn't say already, I'm a political theorist by training. And as such, I do a lot of work thinking and teaching political ideology from a philosophical standpoint. One of the things that quite a few political theorists have been talking about recently is the question of what does it mean to normalize fascism? We definitely see that fascism is being normalized by political actors. So what would it mean to start normalizing the study of fascism for political science? It's not something that's just this exceptional case that only happens in exceptional settings under exceptional conditions, but actually understanding it and unpacking it for our students and for our analysis. So I think through using Michel Foucault's definition of normalization to kind of ground this larger project, and I defined fascism as a populist political ideology that rejects democratic governance because of its definition of the people as homogenous. So it's a very narrow definition of fascism, but we can get into what that looks like in different cases, but I think this captures a lot of it. What's important to note is that democracy is also a populist project, but it's one built in pluralism. So I want to make sure I define pluralism here for everyone so we understand when I'm talking about this question of democracy, what I mean by it. So pluralism is the ethical and material goal of, rather than the state of affairs underscoring democracy, or simply the celebration of difference. So if democracy and fascism share populism, the difference is fascism wants to eliminate difference, democracy wants to celebrate difference. So one of the things I've been working through in this project is it's very clear for political science that our traditional political ideologies, that of liberalism and conservatism, seem to be failing us in a lot of ways for getting at more nuanced analysis. So I want to think through 3 alternative political ideologies: fascism, feminism, and abolitionism. And the next 3 slides I'm going to share have primary, secondary definitions of these terms. Okay, so first, fascism. I want to I want to assert for everyone in this room that when fascism arose, it arose at a time when a lot of leaders who were drawn to fascism were very much afraid, not just of ethnic diversity, but were very, very, very against what they saw as creeping feminization of society. So in Benito Mussolini's famous essay, The Doctrine of Fascism, he talks about these kind of, he uses language like emasculation and chloroformed. Political philosopher Roger Griffin also underscores this in his long study of fascism, where he shows how women, even though they are a danger for the fascist spectacle, they're also a useful mechanism. So women were encouraged to re-experience their commitment to family life, to domesticity, to motherhood within the context of an official worldview that attributed a heroic role to their self-sacrifice for the sake of the future generations. So again, here, the part of fascism is a very narrow tailoring of what it means to be female, and it's very much tied to being pro-uterus, pro-birth. And finally, Klaus Teweleit, the sociologist who studied the German soldiers between the two wars, actually also shows like that they were very concerned with what they called threatening femininity. So again, it's really important to understand that though fascism we tend to think about in regards to anti-racist, like to be very racist, it's also hyperly misogynist. So feminism, how am I looking at feminism? I'm actually drawing from the Black feminist tradition here, and the reason I do so because I actually think it's the most rooted definition of feminism that we have in the literature. So again, primary source I'm taking this from is Combahee River Collective, where the assert is the committed struggle against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, so an intersectional analysis of oppression. Keonghai Taylor is very, she comes back and bringing us back to the Combahee River Collective most recently in her edited volume, How We Get Free. And she underscores there in her introduction the point that it's not just about Black women becoming more in the forefront, it's also what those Black women are doing for the larger needs, particularly of those most disadvantaged. And that leads me to Carol Boyce Davies, the great scholar on Claudia Jones, in her powerful piece criticizing Black political right movements in the form of Condoleezza Rice. So what she calls the principles of US bourgeois feminism. So again, here, I'm thinking about feminism from that very intersectional lens, using the primary source of the Combahee River Collective, but also being attentive to thinking about how others who are not Black can fit into that tradition, especially when we all know that the Democratic push is for interracial democracy and has been since the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. All right, so my last big secondary, alternative political ideology that I look at that frames my work is the ideology of abolitionism. So abolitionism, of course, as I said, this is kind of the root of what I'm working through. Sojourner Truth is the primary source that I have here. Where she writes, "You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our title hold." Of course, this was a speech she gave at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851. But I think it's really important here for thinking through that abolitionism is a political ideology whose aim is at collective liberation. And collective liberation means thinking about freedom from a vantage point of solidarity, as opposed to a vantage point of I need to get what's for me, an individualist standpoint. I also draw on Michael D. Pearson, who really thought about abolitionism and he's a sociological historian who's looking at this project and very clearly, thank you, and wanted to actually really shows that women were at the forefront of the abolitionist movement, white and Black women, but there was a concerted effort to squelch their progress, and that a masculinization kind of took over the project very directly. And last but not least, I'm drawing on Angela Davis's conception of abolitionism in her long-standing interview, Abolition Democracy. And what I think about here, a lot of times when we look at abolitionist literature, we're talking about prison abolition. That is a very important project. I'm definitely in that project in a lot of ways, but what I'm seeing, what I want to show here is that prisons are more than just those material structures that we have. We also have ideological prisons that kind of confine the way we look at things. And I think what she's showing is the social institutions, creating social institutions that will render the prison obsolete. Those institutions look like things like affordable housing, affordable healthcare, et cetera. And a lot of the women that are at the center of the film that I opened up this conversation with, Knock Down the House, are pushing for programs like Medicare for All and affordable housing, clean environment, et cetera. All right. Few more slides. So I'm going to get into the meat of the project. This is again very preliminary. The stuff about craftivism, I'm drawing on the term as developed by Betsy Greer, but also there have been scholars like Samantha Close in communications, as well as our own Valeria Sinclair Chapman, who's been thinking about craftivism in the political landscape, particularly in her analysis of the Moral Monday movements that started in North Carolina beginning in 2013. So what I want, again, thinking about these crossroads, I want to introduce for us to think about the Pussy Hat Project. So the Pussy Hat Project was an idea birthed from the owner of a boutique knitting shop located in the highly gentrified Los Angeles neighborhood of Los Feliz. The hats featured prominently at the Women's March were individually constructed from a pattern purchased via the online knitting resource market and community known as Ravelry. Sorry, noise. So Ravelry got a lot of heat 2 years later when they would ban the sale or sharing of pro-Trump patterns, claiming, quote, support for the Trump administration is undeniably a support for white supremacy. So again, I think that craftivism, there's a lot of leverage here for thinking about our partisan divide right now. But I also want to move towards thinking of craftivism as coming out of the Appalachian tradition. And the reason this matters to me a lot is because I was born and raised in Appalachia in central Pennsylvania. And thinking about also Paula Jean Swearengin as running for the Senate in West Virginia. So real quick, given that crafting and being not quite white, as Matt Ray and Nancy Eisenberg has shown, are both associated with the Appalachian region, this sequence of events that I was just talking about around craftivism provides fertile analytical ground for unpacking the twice failed candidacy for the US Senate by Paula Jean Swearengin of West Virginia, who too was featured in that Netflix film. Focusing on Swearengin, the piece that I'm working on now provides a theoretical evaluation of craftivism as a material ideology in the US political landscape that allows for the retrenchment of traditional political ideologies such as liberalism and conservatism. These ways of thinking, being, and making political decisions leave largely untouched the systematic hold of whiteness as an organizing principle in our society. And using the case of knitting as an exemplar of the white feminist adaptation of craftivism during the political era, some scholars and activists have come to call the Third Reconstruction, my work draws on the political philosophy of abolitionism as developed by W.E.B. Du Bois to provide insight into the following question: how do not quite white women fare in our current political landscape when they run for office? So I'm currently doing discourse analysis of the film and content analysis of the Twitter feeds of Paula Jean Swearengin, Cori Bush, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but I'm still working on that data. But I want to leave you with the one scene that I think really underscores the violence of racial capitalism and how it's playing out in Appalachia right now. So this scene is where Paula Jean visits her mother's trailer on the side of a hill near the woods and asks her about what she thinks about Paula Jean running for office. And her mother, Helen Jean Schwersbury, says, quote, "It scares me to death. Her running all over the state, her being up there with all those senators and stuff scares me to death." I'm her mama. And then she laughs very nervously. There's been people in this state, even in the coal industry, that has just disappeared. You just never find them no more. I'm wondering in which hole of these minds they're in, you know, because I know how things was done in my daddy's day, and I don't think it's changed much. So again, I think one of the question of the kind of violence that is used is very much part and parcel of why it is that white women, particularly in Appalachia, are still choosing what Jane June and others have called the velvet glove in the electoral position that we have. So thank you so very much, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you all for your papers and your presentations. I'm going to be really, really brief to forfeit my time to the audience so that they can ask questions and give comments. So first, Kimberly's paper, I just want to briefly, I'm going to send all of you my comments via email. So, but just looking at or thinking about looking at Black Power movements and how that related to the Pan-African movements and how the relation to those transnational or global movements connect to one another, and maybe potentially looking at that as historical cases that you can use. And for Nykia's project, I have a list of authors and scholars that I think would benefit your research. It's directly aligned with my research, so I found it really, really interesting. But definitely take a look at Evelyn Simeon's work, as well as Paula Gidding's work, Nicole Alexander Floyd's work, Kathy Cohen's work in second marginalization, as well as Claudine Gay and Catherine Tate's work. Looking at Black feminist consciousness and the double consciousness of Black women. And then for Jasmine's project, I really found your theorizing very interesting and enlightening, and would protest in other ways, and I have a list of those that I'm going to send to you as well. So I would like to open it up to the audience for questions and comments at this time, for the time we have left.
I see Felicity has her hand up.
Sorry, Jasmine, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? I saw that Felicity has her hand up.
I can't hear you. Maybe.
Oh, I could hear.
Felicity?
Sorry. Yes. Hi. Sorry, I have a bad connection. But thank you.
Did you have a question or comment, Felicity?
Sorry, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I don't think Ayana can hear.
Okay. Yes, no, I just wanted to ask a question for Jasmine because I found the
Sorry, I'm not hearing anything. Is it me?
Go ahead, Felicity.
Yeah, sorry. So I just wanted to ask in terms of the Craftivism, because it's sort of it's a really interesting etymology, but you also phenomenon. But you also pointed out that obviously, this is coming from, out of a gentrified white area. That this is sort of white middle class women, and so I'm wondering now, is this something that you have particularly noticed from them, or have you noticed sort of craftivism from other social groups as well? And if it is just them, is this something you think can be an effective political strategy in uplifting all other racial groups and women as well?
Yeah, thank you so much, Felicity. I cut out the stuff about bricolage a little bit, so I apologize. I was kind of going fast. So I want to think about, I'm using an Appalachian theorist by the name of Rachel Weisz, who in her contribution to Appalachia Reckoning, a region response to hillbilly elegy, she writes this wonderful essay called Loving to Fool with Things. So there's this tradition in Appalachia where the craftivism that happens there is much more aligned with what post-Marxist scholar Claude Levi-Strauss would say, would call bricolage. Bricolage is using material objects for a purpose that they were not intended to use. So think of like thriftivism. So the craftivism that we see coming out of the Pussy Hat Project is very much within the capitalist framework of a very bourgeois, leisure, middle class, a very bougie kind of version of that. Whereas in the Appalachian tradition, whether we're looking at the work by Bell Hooks or we're looking at the work by Rachel Weisz, again, Black Appalachian, white Appalachian, both theorizing from a very similar place. And as Dr. Hoda Zaki says in the question, how does quilting film fit into my framework in any way? It absolutely does, 100%. I have a larger project I'm working around about quilting as a political theory. This is a smaller project trying to really think about what does craftivism mean in this kind of intersectional position? Because in West Virginia, in the way that I see Paula Jean Swearengin engaging in craftivism is a much more working class conception of craftivism than it is in, closer to what we would call an economy of thrift. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Felicity, and trying to get, again, my whole point is to position away from liberalism and feminists, the liberalist conservative kind of embeddedness in a capitalist conception of market economies about throwing away and buying the new and shiny, towards this other kind of conception, which I think Black women have been doing since bygone, with quilting as part and parcel of their political activism. So hopefully that helps answer that question and to answer Dr. Zaki's question as well.
Thank you, it does answer it, because I was thinking about quilting. I was like, is quilting also a form of craftivism, or is the craftivism the new thing? So thank you, that was very clear.
I see Hashim sent.
Hello, yes, I enjoyed all the papers. I have a comment and a question for Kimberly. One of the reasons why is because she's this kind of transnational, anti-racist, kind of Pan-Africanist movements have been part and parcel of my own life experience. And so I was just interested in the yardsticks that you used. Of course, there were, in terms of impact, of course, there were other eras, the Black Power, Black Panthers period, which also had kind of similar kind of transnational manifestations. But of course, it's right to focus on the Black Lives Matter period, because this is our moment in time, or the movement in time. But the yardstick that you're using is one of elected representation, and yet there were other yardsticks that one could use, because sometimes people engage in protest not because they want to be, of course, part of that any kind of political party activism, but in terms of colonial reckoning, reparations for slavery, kind of battles with racist policing, and how successful and how these have been advanced by transnational movements, and the impact, I think, is also another important yardstick. And then just one comment, Stephen Lawrence was murdered in 1993, I think, not 1998. So that's just a comment, that's all, there's nothing more than that. And of course, it's very easily corrected. But I was just thinking through the degree to which, if we just focus in on the number of elected officials of peoples of color, ethnic minorities, sometimes we probably downplay the impact that these transnational movements are having. So that was just a comment and for your reflection. Sorry, I can't hear.
One of the reasons I didn't is because my era is from 1980 on, and many of the Black Power movements in Britain and others were in the 70s, so it sort of gets cut off because of the scope of the time of the study. And so that's probably why mostly Black Power movements are not included, though arguably you could argue the Black labor Black sections are an actual outgrowth of the Black Power movement. So it's indirectly included, but not directly because of the time period. So that's sort of the reason why I don't do that. The reason I don't really look at others is more of a workability, because even though I'm looking at protest movements here, I'm also my dissertation looks broadly at how crises affect political inclusion, and I have to choose some type of inclusion. So this is looking at movements, but I'm looking at things like, as I'm kind of mentioned in passing, looking at other crises like severe electoral loss, the rise of far-right parties, and other such things. So at some point, it's just a matter of focusing in, and my advisor would say, emphasize this very strongly, focusing on a narrower part, because if I include the other types, then the literature broadens in some ways, in almost unworkable ways, because it is interesting, but for this project, it's just a matter of having to choose a focus, not that these others are not important. It's just, and some of these movements like SOS Racism was focused on increasing ethnic minorities, Black section movements, so some of the movements I'm interested in, that was their focus. So that makes it a more natural choice as opposed to other forms of political participation in some sense.
Thank you. I would also say that the Australians you know, the kind of Australians, they have such a history of kind of racist oppression, both of their own indigenous peoples. And I remember, even though they were a member of the so-called British Commonwealth, I mean, they wouldn't allow people of color even to migrate to Australia until, I think, the 1970s.
1970s.
Yes,
Yeah.
so, I mean, I'm not surprised that they've elected.
But you also have to realize that Canada has a similar history. They also had laws which prevented Black people after, starting in the, around the turn of the century, around the 1920s, they similarly engaged in, had formal legislation which banned ethnic minorities from moving to Canada as well. Yet they have a much larger representation. So in some sense, both of them have those two things. Both of them have, and then this, I haven't looked at, as I said, this is looking at a small segment. So one of the parts of my dissertation is going to look at institutional factors. That includes racially restrictive laws. So Canada has that, and they both ended about the same time. But so it likely influenced it, but there's something else at play here between Canada and Australia.
Are there any other questions or comments for the panel presenters?
So I saw in the chat that Grace just sent me a message. Grace, do you want to let people know about your analysis? I think it's a really, really strong. Do you want to read it for everyone, Grace?
Okay, I can do that. Hi, Jasmine. Well, we started this week discussing the Congress, and we were talking about the disparities that exist in the Congress. And anytime I get to the chapter on the Congress, the one area I get excited about with my students is talking about the House of Representatives, because the minimum age is 25. And I always tell my students, many of you are very close to it. You might be 18 or 19, but it didn't take that long to get to 25. And so you're only responsible for your district. You're not a senator, but you're just responsible for your district. And so as I'm going through these conversations with them, I asked the class, how many people know AOC? And the only ones that will nod their heads are the ones that are watching Fox News. And so, and I'm in Georgia. And one of their homework assignments was, you need to go and find out who are the US representatives for the state of Georgia, and tell us what that number is. And then we're going to tie that back into the Electoral College. But I also say to them, don't you find it odd that you know who AOC is, but you don't know who the number are in your own state of Georgia? I said, there's an oddity going on here. And so then that's when I said to them, I said, I need to research this more. I said, because there's too much focus on this one young lady who's only responsible for her district. And so then we talk about that she's even being considered for the president of the United States. And I'm saying, folks, haven't we been watching what the age requirement is? I said, she's not even there. I said, so something's going on here. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
I think that's 100% correct. And I'm shocked I didn't get the question about, you know, one of the things that's in the back of my brain, looking at this film and looking at the women, right? AOC won her primary. She was the only one out of that whole film. And I don't know if anybody's watched the documentary, but it's a lot of it is so defeatist, and at the end it becomes very high because she wins this primary and then goes on to win her election. But none of the other ones do. But 2 years later, Cori Bush wins in Missouri 1st District, right? A mother, a nurse, an activist, a Black woman who is just very much about pushing for police accountability, and she wins, and she enters Congress in 2021, in January of 2021, and 5 days later she is attacked viciously in her now house of work, but also house of service, with the failed insurrection, the attack on the Capitol building. And I'm sure some of you were at the event earlier today with the wonderful artist and his work on thinking through that day. A lot came to mind in my analysis as well. The two other women, Paula Jean Swearengin, who's featured in the film, does not win, and then Amy Vileda does not win. She's a Latina out of Nevada. But Paula Jean Swearengin in this film is the only one running for senator. That's another point that I think is important to make. But what did she choose to run for Senate in a place like West Virginia? Well, as compared to like a place like New York, well, West Virginia doesn't have that many districts. At its height, it had 6. It now, going into redistricting for next year, only has 2 House seats in West Virginia. Pretty soon it'll only be 1, right? So like Delaware only has 1. There's only one delegate for Wyoming. Sorry, et cetera, et cetera. So what her gamble to push to become senator as opposed to a representative, I think is a really interesting question. And I don't have an answer for that strategy, but I do think there is something happening here with the nationalization of non-national seats and the complete inattention to local politics, which is part and parcel of this conversation. And I think this is why Kimberly's work is so important, because in Europe, you can't get to any national stage without going through the local first. There are so many gatekeepers in these processes. And in those kind of gatekeepers, there's a re-articulation of the political positions, the political ideologies that are conforming those parties. And not just in the United States, I think our work crosses a lot, me and Kimberly's, because we are talking about these questions of how are we defining what it means to do governance? What is the purpose of government itself? So I appreciate that, Dr. Adams Square. Thank you so much.
Hi all. Unfortunately, we are about 12 minutes over and we do need to wrap up. I'm so sorry, but there will be a recording of the session, I believe. So thank you so much, panelists and participants, for your questions.
Sorry, I was just gonna check with her.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, you guys.
But we still have 3 minutes, so they may be.